Hello, hello, hello. You know what? Today is a beautiful day, just like every day is, right? The sun is shining. Sometimes it's just behind the clouds, but as you can see, I got a bit of sun this past weekend. Wanted to jump in here and spend a little bit of time with my friends out in the YouTube universe and talk about a topic today that we've gotten a ton of questions on over the course of the past 2 years or so that we've been doing a lot of social media. Now, YouTube is the channel that is rather the youngest channel, if you will, with regard to social media for us. But in general, I'm a newbie when it comes to social media at all, right? Our very first post on social media was in October of 2021. So this is still something I'm figuring out. And YouTube, we've only been doing really consistently for a few months, but I think a little over a year, I guess, was when we started to launch this particular channel. Well, as many of you may know, I spend a lot of my time, effort, and energy trying to help elevate financial literacy out in the ecosystem that is the entrepreneurial ecosystem. The vast majority of those that we serve are high income owners. They're business owners, they're high income W-2 professionals, they're real estate investors, individuals that have created some of the challenges that money brings along with it, right? The issues related to taxation, issues related to asset protection, issues related to the concept of generational wealth creation. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Specifically, we're going to be talking about something called the Rockefeller Method. How many of you have heard of the Rockefeller Method? If so, let me know in the chat. And if you're watching this on replay eventually, because we're recording this and we'll eventually post this here to YouTube as a video that you can watch over and over again, be sure to put your commentary in the comments section, because I'll be jumping into the comments as well on a forward-going basis. But I'm kind of curious, how many of you in the chat have heard of the Rockefeller Method before? Is it something that it has been top of mind with you, or is it something that you've seen talked about here on social media? Is it something that you have questions about? I'm curious. Let me know in the chat. Curious, because again, I'd always like to get a feeling for who it is that I'm talking about. If you are here on social media and you're interested in elevating your financial literacy, I'd just love to understand the context in which your current financial literacy exists. I know for many, at least the commentary I get back is that your frustrations exist because you were not taught to be financially literate. I mean, our education system here in the United States really is not designed to teach you to be financially literate so that you are independent of the ecosystem. It looks like my team put a question in the chat. Why are you here today? Asset protection, wealth structure, trusts, and strategy. You heard that secrets were going to be leaked today. Yes. So we've got a number of people who have started to reply to that quick little poll. Well, we are here again to talk about the Rockefeller Method, specifically how to create generational wealth by design. That's literally what I do day in and day out with those that we serve, right? We teach business owners how to essentially structure their financial life, structure their business life. We teach high income W-2 professionals how to do the same, how to structure their financial ecosystem. We teach real estate investors how to set up their infrastructure the right way, because the secret ingredient here is infrastructure, right? Again, we're going to be talking about a lot of different things today, but the secret ingredient is infrastructure. Pretty much for every goal and objective you have, infrastructure is the solution. Infrastructure is the solution. See, like, what if, let me pose this question to you for a moment. What if your great-grandchildren still benefited from the financial decisions you make today? What if your family doesn't just inherit your assets, but they inherit a system that protects that wealth and multiplies the wealth for generations to come? And why is it that most families actually end up losing everything that's been built by the third generation? I sometimes call that the shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves problem, right? You have someone who in the family builds the wealth, passes it on, but by the third generation, the wealth is just poof, gone. Right? That's the modern reality that has existed for centuries, right? individuals go about creating wealth, whether that's through the building of a brand new business, the invention of a new technique or infrastructure or system that can be used by individuals. And then you sell that benefit via commerce, right? The buying and selling of goods and or services with the public, and you create wealth, right? But by the third generation, that wealth is eroded. That wealth is eroded. Well, let me say this. If you stick around to the end, I'm going to set up some time and keep some time set aside for Q&A. Again, if you're watching this on a replay, like the video, that doesn't mean you don't get a chance to ask some questions. Just make sure you drop them in the comments section. But if you're watching this live with me tonight, make sure that you go into the Q&A, drop your questions in there. My team is in there trying to organize them. Sometimes maybe they'll be able to answer them live while we're going back and forth. But by the end, we're going to open it up to some Q&A, and we're going to try to address some of the questions that you drop in there, right? So if you're watching this live with us now as we're going through it, be sure to drop questions in the Q&A section and like go into the chat and drop them there. And if you're watching this on replay, that doesn't mean you have to miss out, right? You could drop comments in the comments sections below, and I'll be jumping in there on a forward-going basis, trying to give you some solutions, right? Trying to point you in the right direction. Because my goal is to take you into a system where you elevate financial literacy. Now, what I'm going to talk about, I'm really going to showcase the Rockefeller Method by sort of like juxtaposing it with another wealthy family that sort of did the opposite. They sort of took the approach that most take, right? And they got the result that most get, right? So I'm going to compare the Vanderbilt family with the Rockefeller family. Now, I already know that there are going to be some people who jump into the comments talking about how both of these families weren't necessarily good human beings, not comprised with things that necessarily align with your particular morals. I totally understand that. That's not what I'm talking about today. I'm not trying to justify how the wealth was created, right? That's not what I'm talking about. But I do believe that there are lessons to be learned with regard to how the preservation of wealth is dealt with, right? You see, I speak around the country on topics of financial literacy all the time, right? And a lot of individuals know that I own multiple companies. They understand that I own a private wealth management firm. They understand I own an accounting firm, a fractional CFO company, a tax prep firm. They understand that I own real estate, residential real estate, commercial real estate. And inevitably, I get asked the same question when I get off this stage. They inevitably come up to me and say, Edward, how do I make more money? Well, the number one response is to preserve what you're already making, to keep more of every single dollar you're making, and protect those dollars from all of the enemies at the gate, the creditors, the litigants, the opportunists who want a piece of your pie. And the Rockefeller Method helps to accomplish that outcome. Again, I'm not speaking about how they created their wealth. That is an entirely different dissertation, if you will. But what I want to talk about is how do they protect it? How do they preserve it? And compare that with the Vanderbilt family, who arguably at that moment in time, when the progenitor, if you will, of the wealth created the wealth in the first place, arguably the Vanderbilt family was immensely wealthy. But today, there's no wealth left. Right? The Vanderbilt family is a totally different type of ecosystem than the Rockefeller family, whereas today, the Rockefeller family still controls immense wealth multiple generations later. And there's a reason for that. You see, the secret is not just this concept of accumulation. The secret is systemization. So if you're following along with me, make sure in the chat you drop systemization. Because I want to make sure that you guys are paying attention to what I'm putting down. The secret ingredient here that the Rockefellers mastered above the Vanderbilts is this concept of systemization. Let me know if you're following along. Are you picking up what I'm putting down here? Right? I want to make sure that when we're talking today, I'm going to talk about the Rockefeller Method specifically. Yes, systemization. Did I spell that right? Jason, you did. See, I have to make it difficult, guys. If you want easy, this is not the path, right? I have simple methodologies, but for those who just want to skate through life, this is probably not the place to be. Like, I teach you what really works, guys. Right? Individuals that come into our ecosystem, we teach them the truth about money, right? The black and white, the legal and ethical approaches to creating, preserving, and passing along real wealth, the generational wealth creation mechanisms. So when I look at the Rockefeller method, the real way to put this into practice in your own life is to understand that there are certain pillars, there's a certain framework that the Rockefellers adopted that the Vanderbilts didn't. Again, arguably, the Vanderbilts created way more wealth in the moment, the initial wealth creation. But all of that wealth is gone today, right? At least the original wealth. I mean, there are some Vanderbilt family members who independently created some money of their own, right? But with regard to the actual legacy wealth, the legacy wealth is gone, right? Whereas the Rockefeller legacy wealth is still going very strong. And it's because they took a 7-pillar framework. And we're going to cover those pillars today. Specifically, we're going to cover pillar 1, which is structure over strategy. I'm also going to talk about how protection needs to come first. Like if your objective is to go through this process of creating generational wealth, you need to understand, well, you have to start with protecting what the wealth that you're creating as you're creating it. And again, we're going to talk about why that is so critically important, but that is definitely something you need to pay attention to. I'm also going to talk about this concept of education and governance and how these are related and complementary at the same time. I want to also make sure that you understand the concepts of asset accumulation and cash flow, multi-generational tax strategy, and this is probably not something you're thinking it is, right? So when I'm talking about it in this pillar framework, I'm going to be showcasing it in a totally different way, right, than what you're probably thinking it is. And then I'm going to talk about this concept of centralized control but distributed benefit. Centralized control but distributed benefit. And finally, I'm going to go into the private family office ecosystem and the administrative hub. Like if you look at the Rockefeller family and you look at all of the families that have modeled what they created, you're going to learn that pillar number 7 is why it is a going concern. Pillar number 7 is why it is a going concern. And we're going to cover this in our time together. Now, when I look at pillar number 1, right? Pillar number 1, structure over strategy. Well, we're going to talk about this concept of a hierarchical ecosystem. But at the very top, we need to understand that the backbone of everything that happens in the Rockefeller method, the backbone is this concept of a dynastic trust methodology for ownership. A dynastic trust methodology. What does this mean? Well, it's essentially leveraging a very certain type of trust methodology that lasts for multiple generations, called dynasty trusts, right? And specifically, dynasty trusts in the form of irrevocable trusts. Irrevocable trusts. Now, I believe that when you're getting started, it is perfectly legitimate approach to not necessarily incorporate irrevocable trusts into your ecosystem at first, to really leverage what are called revocable trusts instead. But as you continue your wealth creation journey, you're going to get into a point in time when you're going to start to talk about irrevocable trusts. I'm curious in the chat, how many people have currently a revocable or an irrevocable trust? If you have a revocable trust, drop an R. If you have an irrevocable trust, drop an I. If you have no trust, drop an N in the chat. Curious. I want to know what you guys are currently working with, the tools you're currently working with. You see, right now in the United States, there are about 77 different trusts that exist. I talk about this in our last YouTube live. Some revocable trusts, no trusts. Yeah, I talked about this in our last YouTube live. There are 77 different types of trusts that exist in the United States right now. They all boil down to one of two categories, revocable and irrevocable. The main difference between the two is the permanence, if you will, of the type of document. Can it be changed or not? Revocable trusts they're very fluid. They can be changed at any time by the person who created them. Whereas irrevocable trusts tend to be much more permanent in nature. Once they are drafted and put into full force, again, I'm a lawyer, so I never like saying never, but it is very difficult, if not nearly impossible, to change an irrevocable trust once it is put into effect. So when you're looking at designing your ecosystem, you have to decide, well, what type of trust makes the most sense at the top of your infrastructure? And when we're talking about those types of trusts, those are private documents, which are agreements that you essentially create between yourself as the grantor and whoever the trustee is going to be. In a revocable trust, it's likely you to be the trustee as well. In an irrevocable trust, it's likely to be some third-party trustee. Maybe it's another family member, maybe it's a spouse, maybe it's a friend of the family, who knows. But regardless, it's a private agreement that has a lot of different provisions in the agreement. And one of those provisions is how long does this trust document last? Now, in many states across the country, there is a rule that says trusts can't last forever. That is sometimes referred to as the rule against perpetuities. The rule against perpetuities just basically means the trust can't live forever. Dynastic provisions within a trust allow for the trust to have a multi-generational approach to it. Doesn't necessarily mean it lasts forever, but it gives the capability of creating a dynasty. And when we talk about some of the other things that we're going to talk about in this session, we'll talk about how other members of the family can get involved in creating essentially a in perpetuity type of ecosystem, even though there is this rule of against perpetuities in many states, right? So, because we can get different family members at different generations to engage in this multi-generational planning environment, right? The planning environment. Now, when we look at irrevocable trusts themselves, again, these are much more permanent in nature. Even revocable trusts, you have to contemplate with regard to this irrevocable concept, because a revocable trust becomes irrevocable when the grantor passes away. So if you created a revocable trust today and you die, that trust becomes irrevocable at that point because it can no longer be changed. The grantor who created it is no longer alive, and only the grantor who created it can change it. So irrevocable trusts as a concept, if your goal is generational wealth creation, irrevocable trust as a concept needs to be considered. But in addition to that, what we also need to understand is there are things that are looking to attack your wealth. One of the things that is part and parcel to that wealth attack is this concept of taxation, right? So as you're building wealth during your lifetime, that wealth creation approach is bombarded by income taxes, right? It could also be bombarded with capital gains taxes. It could be bombarded with property taxes. It could be bombarded with estate taxes, right? All of these things are part and parcel to the erosion of the wealth that you're working hard to create. So what we may wish to do is to incorporate different types of entities into our mix that give us the ability to reduce our exposure to that erosion, right? To reduce the exposure to that erosion, to reduce the impact, if you will, of taxation on the wealth that we're creating. Now, there are certain things that can be done that reduce your income tax burden. That comes down to different types of tax reduction strategies, right? I was on the phone with some business owners earlier today, and we were talking about different strategies that they're going to be leveraging between now and year end that are going to result in about 5 figures of in-the-pocket tax savings, right? Now, again, if you're generating $7 to $10 million a year, 5 figures of tax savings may not be the thing that wakes you up and says, wow, I need to pay attention. But if you're in the couple $100,000 range, a 5-figure tax savings is nothing to shake a stick at, right? And now, don't get me wrong, I think anyone, if they saw 5 figures of dollars sitting on the floor while they're walking, they're going to pick it up, right? So the concept of tax reduction is how can you just hold on to more of your own money? How can you protect that money? And we can leverage entities like family limited partners and LLCs in order to control and get tax efficiency within our operations, right? So I teach something called the real wealth matrix, which is the ideal hierarchy of ownership pretty much over everything in your life. We utilize trusts and holding companies and operating companies. We leverage family management companies and special purpose entities and beneficial operating companies. There's a variety of different entity types we leverage, but the objective is multifold. We want to keep more of every dollar that gets made. We want to protect those dollars from all the enemies at the gate, the creditors, the litigants, the opportunists who want a piece of your pie. We want to make sure that we give those dollars a job, right, to go out and find friends, bring more dollars home, right? And then ultimately, we want to ensure that the beneficiaries, the true beneficiaries of what you build, well, they're the people and the causes that you care about, not the government. Who's with me? Who's with me? Who is down for that type of knowledge, right? Let me know in the chat. Say, I am. I am if you want to learn what the Rockefellers have learned about the preservation of wealth. I got a couple 100% going on here. 100% going on here. I love it. Love it. So in order to do that, we need to understand that in order to get some of these benefits, we need to separate ownership and control, right? So this concept of operations versus ownership is important to me. So you can have an ownership position in something, and you can have a control position in something, and then you could separate that entirely from where you're operating. And why is that important? Well, there's a variety of different types of liability that exist for business owners. Two main types, like if you really were to categorize everything into to basic types, there's two main types of liability we have to be concerned with. One is inside out liability. That's the liability that occurs inside of a business ecosystem or inside of something that you own, right? So if we're talking about a business, it's like a slip and fall in the business. If you were talking about real estate, it could be a slip and fall inside of the property, right? That's a risk event that occurs inside of where your wealth is being created, right? Now, we traditionally protect and safeguard that by the use of an LLC as an example, a force field around that business asset. And that helps to prevent the harmed party from reaching through the business to get to your other stuff, right? But again, there's a lot of nuance in doing this the right way. And that's why in our ecosystem, my mentees, we spend a year together in order to help them make sure they're operating their businesses the right way. Because it's not just enough to have an LLC. That's just a piece of paper. It's pretty much worth a piece of paper's worth, right? It's what you do with the piece of paper, how you do actually operate your business that gives you the safeguards that are part of the LLC statutes in your respective state. But the other thing we have to be concerned about is this concept of outside-in liability. This is when you're outside in the ecosystem, the world that exists, and you're just living your life and you potentially cause harm to someone. Can they reach into your business and take your business's assets, or worse yet, take your business, right? That's the outside-in liability protection. We really safeguard that by having a hierarchical ownership structure, right? We leverage the concepts of holding companies and operating companies on purpose. Why? Because we can leverage a holding company in a very asset protection friendly state, like let's say Wyoming as an example. And the operating company could be situated in any other state, even if it's not necessarily an asset protection friendly state. But that's where the operations are taking place, so we form the operating company in that respective state. What we know to be true is that litigation occurs where commerce takes place, right? Because that's where you're exposed to the public. Commerce is the buying and or selling of goods and or services with the public. So an operating company, we safeguard that and separate it from all of the other wealth that you have. The worst situation is that is what you lose. You don't lose everything else. But if the worth, the actual value is owned by the holding company above it, well, that's not engaging in commerce. So that's unlikely to get sued. Now, it doesn't mean it won't get sued, because this is the United States and anyone can sue anyone for any reason they want, right? But the reality is, will it stand the test of that litigation process? And in many regards, it would not, right? Because the holding company is not engaging with the public, right? It's not the harming party. So there wouldn't necessarily be grounds. And again, I'm a lawyer. I specialize in tax, estate, and business law, and I don't want to get too deep into the legalese here. But having a separation, that gives us significant value, right? And the reason why we want to really focus on structure over strategy is because if you have the right structure in place, the strategy falls in line. Right? The strategy falls in line. It becomes self-evident as long as you're working with individuals who understand the rules of the game. Right? There are a lot of rules to the game of business and the rules of the game of wealth creation and preservation. But once you learn those rules, the strategies become self-evident given the infrastructure that is being leveraged. And when you recognize that pillar number 2 is what you need to really focus on first and foremost, the concept of protection coming first, right? Protection coming first, that is the thing we need to make sure that we're doing and engaging in. Now, there are a few different things that the Rockefeller family has done and continues to do that focuses on this protection coming first ecosystem, right? So let's talk about them. The first is the strategic use of permanent life insurance inside of the trust ecosystem. Now, in the chat or in the comments section, if you're watching this on replay, let me know, when you heard the phrase Rockefeller Method, was the first thing that popped into your head insurance? Was the first thing that popped, say yes or no. Was the first thing that popped into your head insurance? When you heard me say the phrase Rockefeller Method, or you saw the post about this live event, Rockefeller Method, was the first thing that popped in your head insurance? I'm curious. Got a lot of no's. I'm actually surprised by that. I'm surprised by that. Because a lot of the advertising that gets done with regard to the Rockefeller Method comes from the perspective of insurance first, right? Like, let's get an insurance policy and let's make sure you do your own family banking. Now, don't get me wrong, that is what the Rockefellers are doing, right? But that's not all they're doing. So that's why I was curious. No. Okay, very, very good, very good. Well, the Rockefellers do utilize this concept of permanent life insurance inside of the trust. And they do that because of the nature of what life insurance is. So life insurance is not an investment alternative. It is a risk mitigation tool. This is why I get into some online debates, if you will, with insurance agents who post on social media, because oftentimes they're talking about life insurance being a great tool for wealth creation. I just don't agree with that. Life insurance is a great tool for wealth preservation. It's a risk mitigation tool. You have a lot of individuals out in the ecosystem selling things like IUL, like Index Universal Life. And I fundamentally have a challenge with that approach in this methodology, because oftentimes those types of life insurance policies are being sold and structured incorrectly with regard to this particular goal, right? It doesn't mean that you could not use certain types of life insurance policies for this outcome. It's just the vast majority of them that I've personally seen in the real world are not structured the correct way, right? Why? Well, life insurance, imagine that it is an account, right? And every time you make a premium payment, it divides that premium payment into 2 separate accounts within an overall account. Account A is the account that handles all of the expenses that are associated with the life insurance itself, right? The actual risk expenses, like God forbid if you died, you have to have money in order to pay out claims, if you will, for that policy. The carrying cost of the operations, if you will, of the life insurance company that's issuing the policy, right? All of the expenses that are associated with the life insurance, a part of your premium payment goes toward that, right? Now, if you have temporary insurance or term insurance, 100% of your premium goes towards those expenses, right? There's nothing left over. It all goes towards that. In a permanent policy, whole life, variable life, universal life, variable universal life, index universal life, Those are all what are referred to as permanent life insurance policies. And the difference between a term policy and a permanent policy is there's a second account into which your dollars go. And that is some form of a cash value account. Now, I personally dislike the use of the phrase cash value because I believe it sort of makes the buyer of the insurance or the individual who's considering purchasing insurance believe too heavily in the fact that that is their money, right? The cash value is just another account that is set up by the insurance company. And quite frankly, the insurance company is the one who owns that cash value account, unless you do something very specific to pull that specific dollar out of the insurance contract, right? There's a certain way you can access the cash value directly, but doing so actually has the potential of voiding your insurance agreement, right? So you no longer have life insurance. So I don't like the use of the term cash value, but that is literally what it's called. So that's what I'm calling it, right? But I want you to understand something, that is an account that is owned by the life insurance company. And you have access to it for different reasons. You can leverage it in different ways. But if you think of it as your money, I think you're already down the wrong path with regard to this process. But why is this important? Well, life insurance policies have a very specific provision under the Internal Revenue Code that govern them, right? And if they are structured in the right way, the money that goes into that cash value portion of the insurance contract can grow. And it could grow based on a variety of different things. It could be the underlying performance, if you will, of the insurance company and how they choose to invest the dollars. It could be the insurance company sets it up in such a way that gives you an option with regard to how those dollars get invested, based on a certain list, if you will, of investment alternatives within that agreement. Regardless, as long as it's structured the right way, and you have not done things to otherwise knock you out of this particular classification under the Internal Revenue Code, as that cash value grows, you do not pay any income tax on it, right? That's hugely powerful, right? It's a tax deferral mechanism. And so long as the money stays in that insurance agreement and never really gets withdrawn by you truly, then there's no taxes on it ever, right? Because the death benefit proceeds of life insurance also are not income taxable to the beneficiary. So a life insurance contract has a lot of tax benefits that go along with it. And here's the interesting thing that the Rockefellers really leveraged to the nines, right? They definitely did it like awesome. They structured their life insurance in such a way where the death benefit was not necessarily as high as it could have been, but the cash value accumulation within the policy was. Now, there always needs to be something like a difference, right? Your cash value cannot equal your life insurance because then the IRS actually treats that as a different entity. They don't treat it like life insurance anymore. They treat it as something called a modified endowment contract. There needs to be maintained a corridor of insurance risk, right? It's called the corridor of insurance specifically. And so long as there is an amount, a difference between the amount of cash value that's in the policy and what the ultimate death benefit is, as long as there's a difference here, a certain corridor, then there's not any income taxation on the growth, if you will, of that cash value account. But what an insurance company will permit many to do is they will issue you a loan guaranteed by the contract. Right? So you're essentially encumbering the contract and getting a loan from the insurance company. And now what a lot of insurance agents will do is they will describe this as you borrowing money from yourself. And that's just not true. Right? I understand the sales technique behind it, and I understand why insurance agents talk about it that way, but it's not your money. You're not actually borrowing your money. You're borrowing money from the insurance company. Now, if you structure it the right way, you can actually accomplish a lot of great things. And that's what the Rockefellers did. They structured their life insurance in just the right way so that the death benefit is pretty low, the cash value accumulation is pretty high, which means the cost of insurance, the portion of your premiums that get paid every period, whether it's monthly, quarterly, annually, whatever your premium payment period is, the portion of your insurance premiums that's going towards the cash value account is much higher, and the portion that's going towards the expenses associated with the insurance contract is much lower, right? That just means more of your premium payment is going towards the accumulation of a cash value account against which you can leverage a loan from the insurance company, meaning you can borrow money. And the secret ingredient to loaning or borrowing money is that borrowed dollars are not taxed to you, right? So you can put money into an insurance contract, allow the cash value account to accumulate over time, and given enough time, you may acquire or accumulate, if you will, a large amount of cash value. And the insurance company may permit you a certain percentage, if you will, of that cash value's worth. They may give you a loan equivalent to that, right? So whatever that particular insurance company's policies are with regard to their loans. Now, protection coming first is critical because what happens was the Rockefellers understood that if we put money into an insurance contract, at some point in the future, not only does it create a protection for my ability to generate income, right? Because if I die, my insurance policy will pay off a death benefit that is not taxable to the recipient, right? It's an income tax-free situation. So it can replace, if you will, my individual ability to generate income, right, to help my family on a forward-going basis. But while I'm alive, I could also borrow from that insurance company policy, right? And that borrowed dollar doesn't get income tax to me either. And maybe I pay that back, maybe I don't. But if there's a scenario where I do not pay and I still have an outstanding loan from the insurance company, my death benefit is reduced by the amount of outstanding loan, right? Which is not taxable. That's why this is so powerful, right? It reduces our exposure to the tax ecosystem that erodes the dollars that we're working hard to create. And that's why the Rockefellers leverage this. The other thing is that there's no qualification to borrowing the money, right? You don't have to qualify to a lender to borrow the money. It's just by contract, you have the ability to borrow based on whatever the cash value is that's accumulated within the policy. So as long as you're paying your premiums and the policy is performing, it gives you the ability to have access to capital, which you could use that money for anything you wanted to. You could go use that money to buy a business. You could use that money to buy real estate. You could use that money to invest in your existing business to create another stream of income or to support your business during a growth phase. I mean, there's lots of ways you can use this. Now, again, I've been called like an anti-insurance person by a lot of insurance agents. It's not because I'm actually anti-insurance at all, right? I actually think insurance is a great tool. I just think that the way a lot of agents sell it is as a tool that it isn't. It is not an investment alternative. It is specifically a risk mitigation tool. It has other benefits, right? And if you structure it the right way, you get those benefits. But here's the kicker. Like the way I just described structuring it, the least amount of death benefit with the maximum amount of cash value, wouldn't it be interesting to know that that actually results in some of the lowest commissions to the insurance agents that there are, right? And listen, I'm an unapologetic capitalist, right? I by far, like I believe in capitalism. But it's interesting to note that the people who are selling it to you are not necessarily incentivized financially to sell it to you the right way. Now, there are a number of actually good, ethical, good insurance agents out there that do structure things the right way. But this is why I'm spending so much time on this aspect of it, because this is a way that this is critical to the Rockefeller Method. But if you do it the wrong way, you can get a really bad result, right? Because you can get a policy that has too high of a death benefit to too low of a cash value accumulation, which just means that you're never going to be in a position where it'll be very difficult or a very long time from which you'll be in a position from which you could actually borrow against that policy, right? Not borrow from the policy, right? Because you're not actually taking money out of the policy. You're borrowing money from the insurance company, and they are essentially guaranteeing that loan to you with the policy itself. Now, there's a lot of other nuance on it, and I have an entire video on how life insurance works. And if you haven't seen that, definitely be sure to jump into that video. I have another video on the Rockefeller Method specifically, right? And how the Rockefeller Method is utilized specifically with regard to insurance concepts, right? So I dive much deeper into that environment. So if you haven't seen that either, go ahead, jump into that. Now, the other thing when it comes to protection is not only do you want to protect your ability to generate income for the family, like that replacement, if you will, of your earning opportunity and potential. You also want to protect the assets from all of those enemies at the gate, right? The creditors, the litigants, the opportunists who want a piece of your pie. And the way you do that is through that layered entity structure that I talked about, right? The real wealth matrix is the ideal hierarchy of ownership because it literally incorporates that layered entity structure. Like we use, again, trusts, holding companies, operating companies. Now, it's important to understand that there is nothing in the law that says what a holding company is. That is a term of art. See, what that means is essentially when I'm saying the words holding company, I'm referring to a business entity that you have created for the purpose of owning other things on your behalf. Right? A business entity you've created for the purpose of owning other things. It could be intellectual property. It could be other businesses. In theory, it could be financial assets, right? There are lots of different ways to have that structure. An operating company, again, nothing in the law that says what an operating company is. It's a term of art. When I use that phrase, I'm referring to a business entity that you've created to engage in commerce, right? The buying and or selling of goods and or services with the public. And when you structure things the right way and have this hierarchical ownership structure, it gives us the ability to have both inside-out liability protection along with outside-in liability protection, right? The other thing we want to make sure is that it is structured in such a way to prevent your wealth journey from being disrupted by things like lawsuits, right? The right infrastructure safeguards against that. Creditors, the right infrastructure safeguards against that. Divorce, the right infrastructure safeguards against that, right? The Rockefellers have a plan in place that incorporate all of those different aspects into the outcome that they're looking to perpetuate, which is generational wealth, right? So having that right infrastructure makes that a possibility. Now, it's important to also understand that in your journey of wealth creation, when you're actually putting this together, it is critically important for you to understand the interplay between education and governance. Education and governance. See, one of the things that the Rockefellers did, like that I believe truly was remarkable, and again, they weren't the first family to ever do this, but they just leveraged it all the way to the nth degree, right? And the Vanderbilts didn't do this. And this is why, again, if you look at the Vanderbilt family, by and large, the legacy wealth is gone, right? See, the Rockefellers understood that there's a big difference between the mindset and the learning opportunities that are created in the creation of wealth and the individuals who are spending the wealth secondarily, right? Different next generations, if you will. So recognizing that there would be a difference in all of the nuances of what it takes to create wealth, recognizing that, they launched a process by which they could pass down that learning opportunity generation after generation. And the way they did that is they essentially drafted what is now commonly referred to as a family constitution. A family constitution. See, a family constitution, this is the articulation, if you will, of the values and the rules that the family is going to live by. The values and the rules. So long as the family wants to actually have access to the wealth that is generational, right? So it's a constitution that essentially lays out to the family, these are the things that are important to us, and this is how we're going to operate, right? And in that family constitution, you could create a family council. This is a governing body, if you will, of members of the family that are going to be responsible for the leadership. Oh, there we go. Responsible for the leadership and the unity that happens within the family. Now, it's important to note, I've been doing this for nearly 30 years. So I've helped thousands of families all across the country, businesses in 18 different industries, right? It's important to understand that when it comes to family disharmony, money is usually in the mix, right? So that's a critically important factor to understand. So when you're setting up a true legacy plan, being articulate with why you're doing certain things and how you're doing certain things, and making sure that you're very transparent with next generations, I think that is critical. In fact, in our ecosystem, we have a variety of different programs where we help business owners. We have what we call Protege, which is our sort of like our mentorship type of ecosystem, where I come in and I help business owners dial in the entirety of their business structures and their financial life and the discussion points that take place and the development, if you will, of a family constitution, the development of the family council approach, right? Coming in to actually set this up the right way. And I can say without a doubt, if you don't incorporate this, it is nearly impossible for your wealth to last generations, right? Maybe one, maybe two generations, but by the third generation, it's almost a guarantee that it goes away, because it's this dynamic that truly sets the Rockefeller family apart, right? If you're trying to follow that methodology, having this governing document that says what is permissible, what is allowed, if you will, for the family to be able to access funds. Because remember, if you have a pool of wealth that's safeguarded inside of life insurance policies, as an example, and you want to create your own family bank, like an ability for either yourself or other family members to be able to borrow from that insurance policy or those insurance policies to use for the endeavor, if you will, of wealth creation, or to use for any purpose, really, right? It could be for the ability to go travel if you wanted to, right? You want to have a set of rules by which family members are permitted to be able to do that, right? And you want to incorporate that into that governing document, that family constitution. And then you entrust in a select number of individuals from in that family to be able to make the decisions, yes or no. Can a family member utilize family resources to do X, Y, or Z, right? Again, this whole concept is not necessarily an entry-level concept when it comes to wealth creation, right? But I'm not necessarily talking to individuals who are entry-level here. If you're watching this, you're someone who's probably interested in figuring out legacy, right? You're probably someone who already has tax problems because you're paying way too much to Uncle Sam, right? Let me know in the chat, like are you paying too much tax? Drop tax in the chat if you feel you're paying way too much tax to dear old Uncle Sam. I know for a fact I talk with hundreds of business owners like all the time who, yep, Raymond, tax, right? Way too much tax. So having a constitution in play that talks with your family and says these are the rules by which you get to access the family's wealth, right? Because that's the mindset shift here. We're not talking about just your wealth anymore. We're talking about the family's wealth, because that's what you're working to create. You're creating generational wealth. That is the family's wealth, generation after generation. So how does a family member access that? How do they access that wealth, right? So the family constitution sets those rules. What are the things that are important to you? If you're the matriarch or the patriarch who are setting this up in the first place, what are the things that are important to you? Do you want to incorporate things like charitable works in the mix? Do you want to incorporate things like enterprise, right? Do you want to encourage your future generations to go out and start businesses? Or do you want to encourage them to go buy businesses, right? Like I have some biases there, right? I think it is way, way smarter to buy profit than to build it, right? It's very hard to build profit. I've been doing it for a long time, guys. It's hard to build profit. It's way better to buy it. So maybe that's something that's important to you. I can say within my family's constitution, we have those types of discussions that are part and parcel to the rule sets that I've created. And I battled with someone recently on this topic because there was like, why should I have a right to say what my great-grandchild can or cannot do with the money that they get access to? My retort was, I'm the one who created the money. That's why I can say it. I am the one who built it, right? I'm the one who built it. So when it comes to this concept, it's important for us to understand that setting up the right rules and the procedures is important, right? The rules and procedures. And it's also important to articulate that openly with those who are part and parcel to those rules, the ones who are going to be governed by them, right? Your family. So that's why we encourage this concept of at least annual retreats where you gather together the family members. Like, again, this is in perpetuity. Every year, you gather together the family members and you just talk about the things that are important to the family. You can incorporate that annual retreat ecosystem into how do individual family council members get voted on, right? You can incorporate that entire process into this concept. And it gives you the ability to instill purpose. Like this concept of real wealth is more than just dollars and cents. What do you do with those dollars? How do you impact society with them, right? Financial literacy, because no matter how hard you wish it to be true, financial literacy just isn't taught in schools. It'll be taught at the kitchen table by you, right? And if you incorporate this concept of a family retreat, it gives you another channel by which to teach the things that are important about money and things about how money really works, which is why I think you guys are watching this, right? Again, I've been doing what I do for, again, nearly 30 years. And I'm still very new to the social media ecosystem, and I'm nowhere near good at it yet. I'm better than I was. Like if you saw some of my first videos, if you will, that was horrible, guys. They're still up. Go ahead, have fun, have a laugh. But I'm nowhere near good. I'm way better than I was. But my goal of doing this is to elevate financial literacy because I hate the government. I'm very vocal about it, right? I love America. I think America is the most amazing country in the world. I just think the government is fundamentally corrupt. And if I can help enough individuals become amazing stewards of real wealth, that means they are less dependent on the government and will actually do things with that wealth that I believe improves society. That's fundamentally why I do what I do. Like I teach you because I hate them, and I want you to succeed because they lose. And I win. When they lose, I win. I'm happy about that. Okay, enough about ridiculousness. Okay. Pillar number four. This is the concept of asset accumulation versus cash flow. And how these things are interrelated. Now, again, I talk about the real wealth matrix, and that's what I teach exclusively within our ecosystem, whether you're jumping into our accelerator environment, our elite environment, our protege environment, whatever it is that you jump into our ecosystem, we teach the real wealth matrix because it is the ideal hierarchy of ownership. It leverages all the concepts that I'm talking about today in this particular session. It leverages all of them and improves upon many, right? But the concept is a hierarchical ownership structure that owns your real estate, it owns your businesses, it owns your investment portfolios, right? This hierarchical ownership structure. Let me again. I'm not a graphic artist, right? I'm not very good at it, but let me try to draw it out for you for a second. If you look at your financial life, pretty much everything that exists falls into one or more of four categories. You have non-passive, you have passive, you have portfolio, and you have personal, right? Those are the four spectrums of assets and income. And I separate them because the income that exists within those spectrums are treated differently. And the asset protection or the liabilities associated with the assets in those spectrums are different, right? So those four spectrums of assets and income are really different from one another and should be attacked differently when it comes to designing the infrastructure that you have. But when I teach the real wealth matrix, I'm essentially showcasing to my ecosystem that there's a hierarchy of ownership. We utilize trusts, we utilize holding companies, we utilize operating companies, right? In the non-passive spectrum, that would incorporate things like your traditional businesses, right? If you own a business and operate a business. This would also incorporate your ability to earn income via W-2. Like if you're a high-income W-2 professional, your financial life, where you generate your income, lives and resides in the non-passive spectrum. Now that gets subjected to both self-employment tax and ordinary income tax, right? From a taxation standpoint. It gets subjected to the traditional tax from a liability standpoint, inside out and outside in liability, right? But this ecosystem can be structured in such a way to help you offset those dangers, right? It can be structured in just the right way to offset your dangers. Like you could have your operating company down here, separate it from the ownership of it, right? Where all the wealth, let's say your IP, your intellectual property, your domain names, your methodologies by which you do business, they could all be owned by your holding company and leased down to the operating company below it. And you may say, well, Edward, why would I do that? Well, because if that operating company ever had a problem, you can close it down and create a new one and now lease those things to the new entity, right? This is what the wealthy do, guys. Like the wealthy have structure on purpose, right? It's intentional by design. When it comes to real estate assets, again, maybe we have trusts, maybe we have holding companies, maybe we have what I call beneficial operating companies, and we may leverage land trusts to actually own real estate, right? And we do this infrastructure because we're trying to accomplish a variety of different goals, variety of different objectives. The land trust helps to keep your name off of the deed. So your name is not on the public record. So no one knows that you personally own this property. Beneficial ownership company, that operating company, beneficial operating company, that can serve now as the landlord, right? The landlord for that property, so that the tenants don't know that you own the property. They're not sending their checks to you. The holding company, we could aggregate, maybe you and your spouse, right? Want to own that holding company together. And why would you do that? Well, we want to leverage the ability to get a K-1 instead of just having all of that income flow to page 1 of your Schedule E. And you may say, well, Edward, why does that matter? Well, if you want to borrow money in the future, you have to recognize that the lenders look at your tax returns and they will evaluate different sections of your tax returns in different ways. Page 2 of the Schedule E, you're looked at more like a professional in the real estate game. And they give you a little bit better weight, if you will, with regard to how those dollars are going into your ability to access capital. Like I'm dropping real nuggets here, guys. This is really how this stuff works, right? This is really how this stuff works. And if you set it up the right way, you can even set up your portfolio spectrum. Again, having your trust at the top of the ecosystem, you can set up a holding company to own your portfolio assets. Maybe that's your crypto. Maybe that's your traditional non-qualified investment accounts. You may say, Edward, why do I want to do that? Well, in your personal life, if you ever get sued personally, that litigator is going to go after your liquidity. And your investment portfolio is very liquid. It's more liquid than your real estate, right? They don't necessarily want to own your house. They want to own your cash. And if you set up a holding company the right way, let's say a Wyoming LLC, we can leverage Wyoming's COPE. COPE, C-O-P-E, COPE. That stands for Charging Order Protection Entity. It's an amazing asset protection mechanism that exists inside of Wyoming statutes, right? This is why this all makes sense, guys. Like when you put the structure in place, and in the personal spectrum, maybe you have different types of trusts. Maybe you have some personal property trusts, right? Maybe you have some, let's say you have a family compound that you're interested in making sure that it stays within the family, right? Maybe you're going to use a qualified personal residence trust to ensure that that property gets passed on generation from generation, right? You could structure things in the right way. You can make sure your will is set up the right way, that your power of attorney for financial matters is set up the right way. Your power of attorney for healthcare matters is set up the right way. Your living will, right? You can set up all of this infrastructure just the right way to get just the right outcomes, right? This is why the Rockefeller Method is so critically important, because when you structure things the right way and you safeguard them, you can now start talking about, how do I accumulate more, right? How can I put every dollar that I get into our ecosystem to work to make more dollars? Because let me tell you this, guys, if you don't give your dollars a job, they become the employee of someone else. And that is the critical difference between someone who's interested in wealth creation versus just someone who's looking to become rich. Don't get me wrong. It's way better to be rich than it is to be poor. I've been both. I didn't come from money. Like my family, we had to work really hard just to get up to the poverty line, right? I'm not saying that my situation was the worst situation that ever existed in the world. It was pretty darn challenging for me growing up, right? It just is what it is, right? But don't get me wrong, rich is better than poor, but it's not as good as being wealthy, right? And this approach is an understanding of, how do I create real generational wealth? right? Because you need to make sure that you have the cash flow, right, that can fund the insurance, that can fund distributions that you want to make during your lifetime to yourself, that can fund philanthropy, right? You need the cash flow that can be able to do that, because here's another truth that they don't teach in the traditional education ecosystem. It's really difficult to spend appreciation, right? But you hear financial gurus talking about all this time, like buy assets, get assets, accumulate assets. Yes, that's definitely good. But an asset, under my definition, is something you control, which generates cash flow for you, because you spend cash flow. You don't spend appreciation. There's a lot of friction to getting access to appreciation, right? I had a discussion very, very recently, just a week or so ago, with specifically with an accountant who was arguing with me and was saying, well, real estate goes up in value. And I agree with that for the most part, right? Real estate over longer periods of time tends to appreciate in value. But the problem is accessing that appreciation, there's a lot of friction. You either have to borrow, which requires paperwork. It's not always easy, right? Sometimes you don't qualify, right? Why? Because most lenders require some form of income, right? Cash flow, to be able to demonstrate that you are a safety profile, if you will, safe profile for them to lend you money. Or I have to sell the property, right? Which also is not necessarily done overnight. See, it's really hard to pick up a house and go to the grocery store and buy eggs with it, right? You need cash flow, right? So structuring your financial life in just the right way is critically important, because you want to ensure that cash flow is something you constantly have access to, right? And I recognize how strange that can sound from someone like myself, who one of the companies I own is a private wealth management firm, which is all about traditional investing. I totally get that. And that has a role, but it's not the end all and be all, right? You have to make sure that the overall structure that you're going for, again, if you're interested in the Rockefeller Method, this is how it works, right? Long-term investment strategies need to be incorporated with the concept of reinvestment of those profits. Now, those reinvestment activities could be towards traditional investments. They could be towards non-traditional, like things like crypto. They could be towards real assets, like real estate. Right? There's lots of different places to invest your cash flow. But you have to make sure you're creating it in the first place, and then safeguarding it, and then preserving it, right, from all of the things that want access to it, including dear old Uncle Sam, like our least favorite uncle. Now, I told you earlier that pillar number 5 would likely be something that you don't think it is, right? Multi-generational tax strategy. I'm not talking about income tax reduction. What I'm talking about is the erosion that happens from generation to generation. And that's this concept of estate taxation. Now, in the Big Beautiful Bill, we've just learned that which was signed into law on July 4th, 2025. We've learned now that the estate tax under TICJA, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, is now made permanent. It was set to expire on December 31st, 2025, and would revert to what existed prior to 2018, which was not necessarily a favorable situation for those individuals who are working towards the creation of wealth. Let's just put it that way. But under the One Big Beautiful Bill, we now understand that individuals, U.S. citizens, right? U.S. citizens have the capability of safeguarding $15 million of net worth from the erosion of estate taxes, right? And if you're a married couple filing jointly and both spouses are U.S. citizens, that's $30 million, guys. That's a reasonably large sum of money. Now, for some of you watching this, you may be saying, well, that's not enough. I'm happy. We should talk, right? But if you are in a situation where you're trying to create generational wealth, you should be aware that there are erosions that take place. And that is in the form of estate taxes. That's in the form of generation skipping taxes, which is a tax that happens when you skip over a generation. Like instead of the parent giving it to the child, the parent gives it to the grandchild. That's called a skip generation. There's this whole set of taxes that occur there. Now, we can use different strategies within the right structure to help us sidestep some of that erosion. For instance, we can leverage family limited partnerships. We can leverage different types of membership units within LLCs that have limited benefit to the owner of that membership unit. Like, for instance, a voting membership unit versus a non-voting membership unit. And that could afford us the ability to get discounts on the value that we may use to move assets into a trust. So let me show you what I mean by that. Let's assume for the moment that we have a business, right? And let's say that business on paper is worth $10 million, right? Its valuation today is worth $10 million. So if we were to want to put this business, and I'm not saying to do this, I'm just using this by way of example. If we wanted to put this business into an irrevocable trust, right? An irrevocable trust, that would mean if all we did was move this into the irrevocable trust, we would have to use 10 million of our $15 million exclusion, right? We'd only have 5 million left over. So if you had other assets, again, we wouldn't be able to move this asset in or the other assets in once we got to that 15 million mark, right? So that's what you would have to do if you didn't use a leveraging strategy. What is a leveraging strategy? Again, same business, right? Let's say it's a $10 million business, but now we own it either in a family limited partnership or an LLC structure where we have two different types, if you will, of ownership. We could have a family limited partnership, an FLP. We could have an LLC. Either way, this concept, this strategy would work. But we have different types of ownership, right? We have A and we have B. A and B. And let's say A has all the voting rights, right? B, no voting rights, right? So no decisions, no decision-making process. Well, just by that nature, B shares or B interests in the FLP are worth less than an A interest, right? If there's an A interest that exists, the B interest is worth less than it because it doesn't have voting, right? That gives us the ability to essentially discount B, and B is the thing we put into this irrevocable trust, right? We get some sort of discounting factor. So maybe we're not using $10 million of our lifetime unified credit, right? Maybe we're using 1 million, right? Because of the discounting factors, because again, this is a private entity, so it's not necessarily marketable. It's not necessarily available for the public to be able to just get access to buy off of the street. So we get a discount for the low marketability, if you will, of the enterprise. We get a discount because the interest that we're putting into the trust is not a voting interest, right? They don't have a say in the governance of that ecosystem, right? And we can structure it in such a way to move essentially $10 million of value, because maybe 99% is B type and only 1% is A type. So it's a 1% interest that gets retained by the matriarch or the patriarch, the traditional business owner, and everything else, the 99% gets shifted in. So essentially $10 million of value gets shifted in, maybe it only costs us from a planning perspective $1 million of our lifetime credit, right? That's what I'm talking about with regard to leveraging the right strategies, right? You can use discounting strategies, right, in order to maximize your ability to pass on wealth with the least amount of erosion from taxation, right? We can use charitable trusts and other advanced planning tools. I had my protege members fly out here to South Florida. We got together. This is back in May. Our next event is in November, by the way. November of 2025. That's our next mastermind event. But we had a bunch of protege members fly in from all over the country, and we spent 4 days together. We talked, each day had a different theme. One of the day's themes was on this concept of philanthropy, right? And the concept of charitable endeavors, and how to leverage them in the right way with regard to the family. We talk about these sorts of things in depth so that our members can actually start to implement them in their own life, right? You see, it's when you understand these pillars and can start putting them into practice, you get the result. And the result is the creation, preservation, and ultimate legacy of generational wealth. But we can't forget about pillar number 6, right? Because this is something that the Rockefellers have also mastered, this concept of centralized control. How many people have ever heard, like, own nothing but control everything? Like, have you heard of that? Own nothing and control everything? Let me know in the chat. Say yes if you've heard that in the chat. Yes if you heard that in the chat. Own nothing, control everything. Own nothing, control everything. Yes in the chat if you've heard that phrase before. See, the concept of centralized control inside of the ecosystem that is the Rockefeller method is that we coordinate the ownership ultimately by the trust at the top of the ecosystem. And if you have your trustees coordinated, right, you have your mechanisms by which these trusts are drafted, your trusts are essentially what own everything on your behalf. Now, if you're starting off in your wealth creation journey, those trusts are likely to be revocable trusts. We talked about that earlier today as we started the session. The more advanced you get with regard to your wealth building journey, you'll start to incorporate irrevocable trusts in your design. But either way, the trusts are the things that own everything. Now, we're doing that for different purposes, right? Some of that could be an estate planning purpose. Some of that could be an asset protection purpose. Different types of trusts have different features and benefits that go with them, right? Again, I did an entire video on that, so you should dive deep into the concept of trusts. In fact, I laid out the specific type of trust that I use, the 5 different types of trust that I use personally. Definitely go watch that video. But the concept here is that you have trustees that are essentially given the task of controlling everything that exists, right? They centralize control. But everyone in the family gets to benefit, right? Because the trustees create the continuity generation after generation. But those separate generations get to benefit from the wealth that gets created under this Rockefeller method, right? Because when you structure things the right way, the beneficiaries are protected from themselves and others. Right? That's critically important, right? How many people have heard of the concept trust fund baby? Put baby in the chat if you've heard of that. Trust fund baby. How many people have heard of that phrase? Trust fund baby. Yep. Yeah. When you think about it, the concept of a trust can be problematic if you don't have safeguards on the trust, right? If you don't protect the wealth that you're building from the people who you're building it for, right? They can blow it, right? I came into a situation, this is a number of years ago now. I came into a situation where the family brought me in after the fact, after the patriarch in that situation had passed away. And one of the beneficiaries really didn't have any controls that were built into the trust to help preserve the trust, and had literally spent down almost all of the trust that was associated for them. And this was into the 8 figures of wealth that had been set aside by this patriarch for this particular beneficiary. But the beneficiary had some personal life problems that they were dealing with. They were definitely addicted to the concept of spending. They ended up buying, I think when I came into the picture, I think he had 11 different cars. 11, guys. That's like 11 different automobiles. And again, unless you're truly a collector, you don't need 11 cars. He would go and he would travel, and he would bring his supposed friends with him anytime he went to travel, which was a lot, right? And he blew through 8 figures in a very short period of time. And I was brought in after the fact to try to assist the rest of the family of dealing with the ramifications of this, because eventually he was going to spend it down entirely. And there was nothing we could do, because at that point in time, it became irrevocable. The trust, the way it was drafted, was set in stone. There was really no safeguards we could put in place. So we sort of did like a family intervention with him. And it definitely didn't go well the first time. And I say that on purpose because we actually ended up having multiple family interventions with him. But we eventually got things under control. Unfortunately, after the fact, he had spent a significant, large sum of money. So we couldn't get that money back. It was literally just gone. But on a forward-going basis, we were able to help direct activity in a much more productive way. But having the right protections in place for your trusts are critically important towards that outcome. And the Rockefellers did this very well, right? They have safeguards in place. They have incentive systems, right? Distributions that are tied to value-based incentives. Like there are provisions that you can incorporate. Things like, hey, listen, if you're ever convicted of a felony, you lose access to X, right? Whatever X is. Or if you're ever like in a situation where you become convicted of something like a drug-related crime, right? You'd have to do X, Y, and Z in order to get access back so that we know you're not spending those dollars on drugs, right? You can create incentive provisions to benefit the family to say, hey, listen, if you want access to money, you have to be a productive member of society. So if you want access beyond health, education, maintenance, and support, if you want something else beyond that, well, you need to go out in the world and earn $1, and we'll match a certain amount of the dollars you earn, like dollar for dollar or 50 cents on the dollar, right? I have certain provisions like that within our own ecosystem. You can incentivize for charitable works, right? You could say, hey, listen, if you go out and donate your time, the trust can pay you for the time you donate to charitable works, right? So you could earn some money from the trust for doing those sorts of benefits to society, right? You can craft it in such a way that actually accomplishes goals and objectives that are values-based. And pillar number 7, critical to understand, is this concept of the private family office and administrative hub. Now, this is essentially what we do here at Hub Level. We're essentially what would be considered a fractionalized virtual family office for those families that we serve. And we have different degrees by which we do that, right? We have degrees by which you can come into our ecosystem and do a lot of the work on your own. You have degrees that you can come into our ecosystem and be much more like an individual who benefits from the coaching that we provide. You can come into our ecosystem and we mentor you, right? And we have one-on-one type of relationship where I specifically guide you in how to structure your financial life and your business entities in the right way to accomplish the Rockefeller Method, right? But the private family office administrative hub essentially is the creation of an internal family office that you build yourself, or you work with an outside virtual family office to accomplish all of the different things, right? The coordination of the legal, the tax, the investment, the insurance, and the philanthropy, right? To make sure that it's working together in just the right way to get the right outcome. The Rockefellers definitely did this. Now, the Rockefellers adopted what is called an internal family office, where they essentially establish their own family office. They hire their own attorneys to be full-time and work in the family office. They hire their own tax professionals to handle all of the tax return preparation only for that family. They don't work with anyone other families. They hire their own investment managers to manage the money of the family, right? That don't have other clients. They just manage the money of the family. They have their own insurance professionals that manage all of the different types of insurance that the family needs. They hire their own professionals to engage and manage the philanthropic endeavors of the family, right? That's what a family office is when it's an internal family office. Now, the opposite of that, or the juxtaposition of that, would be a virtual family office, where you essentially tap in to a variety of different professionals that are needed based on your stage, if you will, of wealth creation. Maybe you don't need all of those professionals in-house with all of those respective salaries in-house that your family has to pay, right? Maybe it's much better for you to engage in a fractionalized virtual family office where you can leverage the professionals that actually know what they're doing to help you, but they don't work 100% of the day, every single day for you. They work with multiple families, right, in order to help reduce the amount of cost that is for you, right? But the concept of securing that ecosystem for what you do is critically important, because this gives you the ability to start thinking about, well, what does succession planning look like, right? Not just for the generations, but also amongst our professional team, right? How do I ensure that the accountants we have working on what we do within our family actually know what they're doing, right? That they file the right returns at the right time. They handle all of the nuance of not just the tax preparation, but they understand how to employ strategy for tax reduction. See, the vast majority of accountants out there are little more than glorified historians. They spend most of their time, their effort, and their energy just trying to figure out how to best tell the IRS what already happened, right? The Rockefellers understood that, yes, you need that, but that's not the same as tax strategy. A tax strategist is proactive. What should you be doing next week, next month, next year to ensure that your tax burden is lowered? That's the challenge, guys. Like the ecosystem is not set up to help you understand what it is you really need, right? You're constantly being sold what they want to sell you, as opposed to finding what it is you really need in order to get what you really want, right? And most individuals that I talk to, at least, when we sit down and really start hashing this stuff out, they want generational wealth, right? Because that is the true measure of success when it comes to success in business, right? Winning at the game of business is not about revenue. Revenue is a vanity metric. I don't care how much you make. What I care about is how much do you keep, how much do you protect, how much of that you kept and protected gets to work to make more, and ultimately, who benefits from it, right? Is it the people and the causes that you care about? This is the secret sauce, guys. And that is why critically important to understand how all of this works. And at the heart of it is infrastructure. At the heart of it, it's infrastructure, right? Because when let's think about this from the case that the vast majority of individuals are not going to be at the stage where the Rockefellers are today. And if you are and you're watching this, let me know. Did I get anything wrong, right? Been doing this for nearly 3 decades. I've been helping families all across the country, businesses, 18 different industries, real estate investors, high income W-2 professionals, right? You can leverage these concepts because you don't need $100 million, $500 million, $1 billion to begin implementing this, right? You could be a business owner that's, relatively speaking, still in the getting started phase of life, right? You could be a professional, a high income W-2 earner, right? You could be a real estate investor that maybe has 1, 2, 5 houses, right? You don't need a portfolio of 700 doors to make this be something that's worthwhile for you, right? I was talking, we brought a new entrepreneur in recently, and we were talking about the concept of trust-owned life insurance, right? And how we can leverage that. Now, it's going to take some time, right? And this is the other thing that doesn't get told to you by a lot of insurance agents. Leveraging the Rockefeller Method and creating a family bank that is essentially backed by a life insurance policy or a set of policies, that doesn't happen overnight. It happens over years, right? So you have to be willing to commit to multiple years of premium payments before you would ever start to tap in to the loans that are available from the insurance company that are guaranteed by the policy, right? It's years that we're talking about. But we're setting in play now a plan that over the course of the next 5 to 7 years, we'll then have another avenue by which to have choice, right? Because that's what we're talking about, right? Creating a life insurance policy from which to be a family bank is a choice then in the future. I could borrow from the insurance company, backed or guaranteed by my insurance policy. I could do that. Or I could continue to use traditional financing mechanisms, whether that's traditional lenders or other hard money lenders. There's a variety of different other avenues. But this is just now one additional choice that you have in your potential tool chest, right? So we were talking about that. And again, an entrepreneur, relatively young in the entrepreneurial journey, about 3 years deep into the business, earning about that $150,000 to $175,000 of net operating income per year right now, likely to get into that $200,000 to $500,000 range, relatively within the next 2 to 3 years. Already all set. We started to map out what that looks like. Definitely someone who benefits from this strategy. I had a recent real estate investor jump into our ecosystem, and we're going through the entire process of restructuring their entire life, right? Now, we're talking about well into the 7 figures of net real estate, right? Not including like the actual value of the real estate is well into the 8 figures, but there's leverage on that real estate. There's loans against it. But the equity position, well into the 7 figures of real estate. But that real estate is all owned by them directly. Now, either directly, truly outright, or in LLCs that their name is attached to. So we spent a lot of time like really building out the infrastructure and saying, okay, we need to change some things around, right? And we're leveraging the Rockefeller method there. I have individuals who are high income W-2 professionals who have the financial wherewithal because they've safeguarded that wealth by putting it into what I refer to as storage of capital positions, right? They stored their capital. Now they can go and work to leverage that capital towards the acquisition of assets. Those assets could be businesses that they acquire, it could be real estate that they acquire, but again, leveraging the infrastructure that is the real wealth matrix, which is essentially what the Rockefellers have been doing, right? That's why this is so powerful, guys. This is so powerful because the true value, if you take nothing else away from what I've shared with you today, is that there is a method to the madness, right? This doesn't happen by accident, it happens by design, right? You can get rich by accident. That can happen. You can't get wealthy by accident. That's not possible. And I'll be happy to debate anyone who says otherwise. Right? It is impossible to become wealthy by accident. It's very possible to become rich by accident. And don't get me wrong, rich is way better than poor, but it's nowhere near as good as wealthy. And that's what we're talking about. Because legacy, again, legacy is not what you leave behind. It's what you leave in motion. Right? That's the systemization, right? When we talked about at the beginning of this session, the concept is not about just accumulating assets. It's not about accumulating that wealth mechanism. It's about the systems that you put in play. It's the operating procedures that happen within the family, the family constitution, the family council, right? How do family members get access to the wealth that the family has worked hard to create in the first place? How do they go about making sure that everything that happens lasts generation after generation, is not subjected to erosion or ridiculous erosion from taxation? Like I don't want you to send a single penny more than you absolutely have to the IRS, right? Making sure that it's safeguarded from the creditors that are out there that want to take a piece of your pie, the litigants who want a piece of your pie, the opportunists who want a piece of your pie. Safeguarding the wealth so that it doesn't become aspects of marital property, so that it doesn't get lost in a divorce scenario. Again, we all hope for the best, but you have to plan for the worst. And that is what we do here inside of UpLevel. We focus on how do we create the right dynamics of everything that goes on in your life, which is why I'm so passionate about talking about all this stuff, guys. Hopefully this has been of value to you. Hopefully this has been of value. We spent a good amount of time together. We talked about a variety of different things, all within the realm of the Rockefeller method when it comes to the creation of wealth. But I told you if you stuck around, I'd open it up for some questions. So with that being said, I'll pass it over to my team. I know that some of you may be interested in figuring out how could you potentially work with us. If my team wants to put in the chat an application process, you have the ability to apply. We don't work with everyone, but we do work with a select few. Whether you're a business owner, whether you're a high-income W-2 professional, whether you're a real estate investor, you could definitely jump into the application process. But with that, let's jump into question number one. Dustin asks, should I set up the Real Wealth Matrix first before buying a business? So I'm very biased in this approach. So what I'm going to say is self-serving. But I would absolutely say yes, you'd want the right infrastructure. It doesn't have to be a complex one, right? You don't have to develop out all aspects of the Real Wealth Matrix in order to venture into it, but you want to understand how is it that you're going to own this business in the first place, right? What is the process? How are you going to go about actually buying the business? Are you going to be buying the business or are you going to be buying the assets of the business? I'm typically going to be an advocate of the latter, not the former, right? I typically am not going to suggest that you go out and buy the business. I'm going to suggest you buy the business's assets, which could include its client list, its IP, its domain registration, its systems and processes, the inventory, maybe like the assets it owns. I just wouldn't buy the business because when you buy the business, you're also acquiring all of the known and unknown liabilities, right? So I wouldn't give yourself that risk profile, but you want to structure things the right way. So hopefully, Dustin, that helps answer your question. I'm sorry if I pronounced your name incorrectly. So Mai Nelson writes, should my taxable investment account be owned by my trust or an LLC owned by my trust? Within our ecosystem, again, let's showcase this for a second. I believe I did draw this out up here. Yep, I did. So in the portfolio spectrum of the Real Wealth Matrix, we utilize trusts to own holding companies, and I have that holding company be the thing that owns your non-qualified financial assets, your personal checking accounts and savings accounts, your personal CDs, your personal investment portfolio, right? Not talking about your retirement assets, right? Not your IRAs, your 401ks, your 403bs, your Roth accounts, like none of those. I'm talking about your non-qualified. Those are all the assets that don't necessarily get a preferential treatment regarding the income that's built out within those, right? So your directly owned assets, I like owning that inside of a holding company, which is owned by the trust, right? And again, there's a variety of different ways to set that up. Be sure to jump into some of my other videos inside of YouTube that talk about that. And if you're ready, be sure to consider applying to see whether or not we may be a fit. Okay. Awesome. Dustin asks, should I have all my investments in a trust? Well, Dustin, I just answered that from my, when it comes to non-qualified investments, I'd encourage you to consider the use of a holding company. And again, we do that for a variety of different reasons. One of the main reasons is to create a charging order protection entity that safeguards your liquid assets from those who want to take access to them, right? The creditors, the litigants, right? The plaintiffs that may come after you personally. We want to make sure we're safeguarding that. So hopefully that helps to give you some concept there. Nucleus Entertainment. That's an interesting name, a little label, if you will, on your name. So Nucleus asked this: what's the biggest mistake people make when they try this on their own? Ooh, they make a lot, right? So the reality is this. Most people will approach this in what I call a piecemeal fashion. Like they'll go out and they'll find an asset protection attorney to help them structure their business to safeguard it from outside forces. Then they'll go and try to find an estate attorney that can help get their will set up and their trusts set up. Then they'll go and find a financial advisor to help them understand the management of their investments. Then they'll go and find a tax professional, right? Someone to help file the tax returns the right way. But the problem with all of that is they almost in every circumstance fail to find someone who can communicate with all of those different disciplines and ensure they're all on the same page, right? It's sort of like trying to build a house without a general contractor. You may be really lucky and find an amazing tiling guy, but if he tiles the driveway instead of your kitchen, you're out of luck, right? And that's the coordinated effort that like a company like mine provides. Like we come in and we make sure that all of those different disciplines are coordinated towards the same objective, which is generational wealth creation. Because the reality is something that you do over in the asset protection realm is absolutely going to impact what happens in legacy. It's absolutely going to impact what happens in portfolio and what happens with regard to maybe the real estate that you're owning, right? All of those things have to play nicely together so that you actually get the outcomes that you want. So hopefully that helps give you some direction. So with that being said, if you have not yet jumped in to apply to see whether or not we'd be a fit, but you're interested still in learning more, I'd encourage you to consider jumping into our webinar. We have a webinar tomorrow where I'm going to be showcasing how the Real Wealth Matrix gets utilized by those we serve, right? The link is in the description, and you can jump into the chat in order to sign up for that. Tomorrow's session, I believe, is at 7 p.m. Eastern. Right? So if you have not yet jumped into that and registered to attend that, you're doing yourself a disservice, right? Why not find out more information? But if you're ready to jump ahead of the line, right? If you're interested in figuring out whether or not we'd be a fit, you don't have to wait for the webinar. You can jump right in and just apply. We have a questionnaire that asks you a number of questions to see whether or not it makes sense. And if it does, then we'd put you in touch with my team and coordinate a conversation to see whether or not that would work. When it comes to the next steps are either apply to see whether or not we're even a fit, because if we are, then we can have a conversation. If we're not a fit, I'll tell you that too. I'm pretty direct, pretty open, pretty honest with everything that we do, right? It's very transparent, our process. And if you want to find out more about the Real Wealth Matrix, be sure to register for tomorrow's event, where we're going to be talking about the Real Wealth Matrix and how I use it specifically to help safeguard wealth, help reduce exposure to taxation, and leverage it to help business owners win at the game of business. Awesome. With that being said, I hope you had enjoyed your time. I had a lot of fun. And until next time, be well. Bye for now.